Athalia is one of the most important and tense female names in the Bible. She was connected to the royal family and lived near people who changed Israel's past in cruel ways. This made her a real example of what happens when power is used without spiritual control. The queen worships idols, and the king is evil and weak. What can come from their womb? There is a lost story about a woman who not only lived through the chaos, but also made it worse. What kind of person was Athaliah? Are they just a piece on the political game, or are they the next generation of people who disobeyed the God of Israel? The truth was that she wasn't just heir to a throne, she was also heir to an idea that had sold people out. And it was this poisonous heritage that she decided to pass on without any doubt. It all starts with the tracks her parents took before she was born. Ahab, the son of Omri, was king of the northern kingdom of Israel from 874 BC to 853 BC. He was good at diplomacy, but he was more famous for something more sinister. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all who were before him. 1 Kings 16:30. His life changed when he married Jezebel, who was princess of Sidon, daughter of King Ethbaal, and a priest of Baal. A bond was made between light and evil, between the promise made to Israel and the strange gods of nearby nations. It wasn't just a union between two royal houses. Jezebel didn't just come to Israel as a visitor. She brought with her a full, organized, and very tempting religion system. Altars were set up. A lot of show and circumstance was used to make worship of Baal, the god of storms, and Asherah, the goddess of fertility, the official religion. People who spoke for the God of Israel were attacked, shut up, and killed. The cries of pagan gods and the profane rituals that swept the country seemed to drown out the word of the Most High. And when the prophet Elijah stood up to fight this darkness, a fight was bound to happen. In 1 Kings 18 on Mount Carmel, God reacted with fire to show who the real Lord was. Jezebel was so mad that she tried to kill Elijah, but he got away. She did not stop having an effect, though. In 1 Kings 21, Jezebel tricks the courts into killing Naboth, an innocent man, so that her husband can get what he wants. Instead of telling her off, Ahab gave in. So, the throne of Israel became a place where abuse and worship of false gods happened more and more. Athaliah was born in a place where people killed each other, lied to each other, and worshipped idols. Even though the Bible doesn't say much about her youth, it seems likely that she was taught to be like Jezebel. She has seen people make choices out of pride and disrespect for the laws of the Lord since she was a child. She wasn't taught to follow the God of Israel. Instead, she was taught to be a strong woman who was used to ruling, killing, and dominating others. Later, her name shows up when she married Jehoram, son of King Jehoshaphat of Judah. This is a political union between Judah and Israel. But what was supposed to connect the countries turned into a way for evil to spread. Athaliah made it possible for people from other countries to follow Baal. The shade of Jezebel was now also over Jerusalem. The story of Athaliah is not over yet. No matter where she went, though, one thing was clear from the start. True faith died and fear took over. Before we go on, watch this movie and share it with someone who needs to remember that God is still in charge, even when things go wrong. Join our station if you haven't already, so you don't miss any of these stories that show how heaven is always doing things. Also, please leave a super thanks if you want to help this work. We can keep telling more Bible stories and spreading this message of faith and hope thanks to your gift. Thank you so much for your help. We'll keep going on our journey today. Athaliah was not only Jezebel's daughter, but she also looked a lot like her mother. She grew up near the shrines of Baal and went to school in a place where power was more important than religion. As a result, she took on the coldness, ambition, and tactics that were typical of her family. You could say that she crossed the line from Israel into Judah when she was married to Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat. She also brought with her the spiritual poison that had destroyed her family home. In a way that was different from hers, Joram had grown up. His father, Jehoshaphat, was a Judah king who loved God more than any other. People were told to seek the Lord during his rule, temples to false gods were removed, and justice was done out of fear of the Most High. The country was stable, peaceful, and growing while he was in charge. But like many good-hearted kings, Jehoshaphat thought that making political deals would keep his country safe, so he let his son marry Ahab's daughter. At first glance, this marriage looked like a smart way to show goodwill. It brought two sister countries closer together, stopped the fighting that was going on all the time, and promised peace in the area. Athalia planted a spirit of rebellion against God in Judah, which could not be seen behind the royal robes and formal smiles. This spirit was dangerous and hard to detect. As the wife of the crown prince and a woman with political and religious power, Athaliah had become a well-known figure in Jerusalem since she became famous. She didn't want to just follow the rules of Judah, so she slowly brought in things that were popular in Samaria. The rules set by Jehoshaphat were almost imperceptibly broken by the way she thought and behaved, and Jehoram went down bad roads even though he was the son of a good king. In 2 Chronicles 21, the Bible says that when Jehoram took the throne, he not only didn't follow his father's lead, he went in the same way as Ahab's house on purpose. For fear of competition, he killed all of his brothers. He gave up on the Lord's law. He built altars to false gods and got Judah to worship them. Because her past was shaped by worshipping idols, Athalia not only agreed with these choices, she pushed them. It didn't take long for the events to happen. Thanks to Jehoshaphat's loyalty, the country had grown stronger, but quickly fell apart. During Jehoram's rule, the country was attacked by nearby peoples. There were rebellions within the country, and the religion began to decline. Kings were supposed to work together, but instead they disobeyed, which was a terrible fruit. What was most sad, though, was how quiet everyone was. Many people in Judah who were used to fairness and respect kept quiet when Athalia and Jehoram went against the rules. It became less important to worship the Lord. People forgot about the teachers. People looked down on the refuge of the Most High. So what started out as a political deal turned into a moral split. It was Jezebel's daughter who took the seed she planted in Israel and made it grow in Judah. And things that were once seen as holy were now savaged without any fight. Even though Athalia didn't have a crown, she already controlled with her hands, which set the stage for something even worse. In the past, Judah was known for following the rules set by the Most High. Those days were ending. When Jehoram and Athalia worked together, they cast thick shadows over the country that had once been home to the temple of the Lord. On the hills, altars to foreign gods sprung up all over, and carved wooden poles honoring Canaanite gods became very common. The sacrifices that were once made to the God of Israel were replaced by ceremonies for gods who had never saved the Israelites from Egypt. This drop in spirituality wasn't ignored. Jehoram got a letter from Elijah, the same prophet who had spoken out against Jezebel during the reign of Ahab. It was a final warning. In it, the Lord's helper not only spoke out against the king's evil, but also warned that judgment was coming soon. According to 2 Chronicles 21:12-15, the text said that bad things would happen to the royal family, the people would be sick, and the king himself would die of a disease. Even though he wasn't there, the messenger spoke for God against the evil that was going on. Elijah didn't just say these things to warn people, they really did come true. Invaders from other countries stole from Jerusalem. Jehoram's boys were killed, and the king himself got a painful intestine disease and died without anyone being sad about it. The throne, which was once a sign of honor and power from God, had turned into a place of shame and destruction, but the harm was done to more than just Jehoram. Athalia stayed, and with her the spiritual influence of Jezebel lived on in the people of Judah. It wasn't just that Athalia was the king's wife that gave her power. She was a dark kind of leader, one who wasn't motivated by fear of the Lord, but by lying and making people afraid. Though many people thought of her as just a royal spouse, it was clear what her real job was. She led, decided, and managed. Her power came from worshipping idols, politics, and people not speaking out because they were afraid to face her. To understand how bad this rot is, you have to look at how important the groups that Athalia brought in were to the culture. Baal and Asherah were not just names for gods, they were also spiritual structures that shaped the lives of whole groups of people. Baal was linked to the land's fertility, rain, and the success of farming. He offered obvious blessings in exchange for sacrifices and sensual rites that made him happy. A lot of these crimes involved forced prostitution, and sometimes even the blood of children who were not guilty. People worshipped Asherah as the mother goddess and left gifts at cut poles or dedicated trees during celebrations that mixed faith with very bad behavior. It was a faith that played on people's baser instincts, hiding its immoralities with promises of security and fertility. People's devotion to these gods not only kept them from God, but it also killed the morals that kept the bond with the Most High in place. Judah, which had been protecting the promises made to David up until that point, was taken over by these outside forces. Mixing different religions' ways of worshipping the Lord made it dirty. People used to be led by leaders who talked to prophets, but now they bowed down to carved figures instead, ignoring warnings from God. What used to be a country that stood out because of God started to look like every other pagan kingdom nearby. All of this was linked to one name, Athaliah. She not only brought worship of false gods to Judah, she also made it official. What was going to happen next would show that her desire for power did not end when her husband died. She would still own the throne, no matter what. The promise that God made with the house of David was what made Judah who they were. 2 Samuel 7:16 says that the throne would be passed down through his family forever. This is not an absolute right, but a promise based on submission and love to the Lord. The people of Judah were very proud of this tradition because they saw the temple as a sign of God's presence among them. As Athaliah became more powerful, though, this legacy started to be tainted by a cult that didn't see the God of Israel as holy or unique. The ceremonies that came from the north not only put the faith at risk, but they also changed what it was all about. With his carved statues and wild rituals, Baal was a god who people thought could be manipulated. People who worshipped him thought that offerings, even the worst ones, could bring fertility, crops, and safety. In turn, Asherah led a sensual and interesting group that was based on practices that made life and human respect less important. Even though they were called spiritual practices, these rituals were actually bad for society's morals. The songs and proverbs of David had changed Judah, but now the people there were doing things that put selfish wants ahead of righteous ones. There was a big difference between the two ways of prayer, in contrast to the Israelite faith, which taught people to obey, repent, and work for social justice. The foreign cults promoted immorality, abuse, and violence while pretending to be religious. When the people lost touch with the real God, their faith turned into a way to trade with stone statues. This change had very important effects. It used to be that the temple was the spiritual heart of the country, but it lost its importance. Faithful preachers were shut up, and people who followed Baal gained ground. People started to think that the truth was unpleasant, and justice was slowed down by what was best for politics. As her mother had done, Athaliah not only let these groups happen, she also supported them and punished anyone who tried to speak out against them. There was a growing gap between those who were true to the Lord and those who followed pagan cults. People who still believed in the God of Israel hid. Society was breaking up. Faith, fairness, and custom, which kept Judah alive, were being taken away from the throne. The leaders used to follow Moses' rules, but now they worshipped other gods and their tainted preachers. As Athaliah worked on her plan to take over politics and religion, Jehoram, the king who was meant to protect the people and set a good example, died. 2 Chronicles 21:18-19 says that he died of a terrible sickness. His body got worse over time, and his mind was heavy with cheating. Jehoram was hurt in war and in honor, and he knew the bad results of his decisions. There were no tears when he died, no weeping in public, there was no big event. Unlike his father, Jehoshaphat, who was buried with royal honors and was known as a loyal worker, Joram was buried away from the tombs that are only for kings. His death showed that God had turned away from him and that people didn't respect him. It was the end of a sad era, not one full of glory. But Judah's throne was still open to attack. Even though Athaliah was now a widow, she didn't seem to be going to give up. She still had her eyes on power, and she wouldn't think twice about crossing any line to get it, even if it meant erasing David's children and grandchildren for good. The spiritual trouble in Judah did not end when Jehoram died. When his son Ahaziah took the throne, he didn't return to the Lord's ways. Instead, he made the rebellion even worse. The mistakes he made in his life showed how much his mother affected him. He had a mother named Athalia, who was powerful behind the scenes. Now she had a direct effect on the new king's heart and decisions. 2 Chronicles 22:3-4 says that Ahaziah followed the ways of Ahab's house because his mother told him to do bad things. Because of this poisonous impact, he made the same mistakes as his predecessors, worshipping false gods, making bad partnerships, and not caring about his spiritual life. Once more, the kingdom of Judah was pulled away from the bond that kept them separate as a people. Even though she wasn't actually on the throne, Athaliah was the real power behind the crown. Ahaziah's rule was short and full of trouble. While going to see King Jehoram of Israel, who was healing from being hurt in Jezreel, Ahaziah got involved in something he didn't expect. God raised up Gehazi to punish the house of Ahab. He took divine revenge for all the sins that family had committed over the years. It was a surprise, and Ahaziah was killed. He was the last direct link between Judah and Jezebel's spiritual legacy. His death was sad, but it was seen as the end of an era. With the death of her son, Athaliah had an empty throne and a one-of-a-kind chance. She had already been close to power and had an effect on kings and choices. Now, though, she wanted more. She wanted to rule without any guides. What happened next showed how ambitious she was and how bad she was as a person. Athalia was determined to get rid of any opposition to her rise to power, so she had all of David's royal relatives, including her own grandkids, killed. Children who were not guilty were killed in order to protect the throne. The bloodline that carried the holy promise was almost wiped out by a woman who was obsessed with power. It wasn't felt bad, without a doubt. It's just coldness and political calculations. In 2 Kings 11, this terrible event is called one of the most important in Judah's history. Athaliah was the only woman to rule the southern kingdom. She did so not because she was praised by the people or because God wanted her to. Her rule started with a scream of horror at how holy God was, and a direct challenge to the deal that David and God made. If anything, Athaliah made the worship of Baal even stronger while she was queen. The temple was pushed to the edges, and people who stayed true to God were hurt or silenced. The country used to be led by leaders who sought the Lord, but now it bows down to fake gods and a cruel queen. Even so, something got away from Athaliah in the middle of the darkness. The spark of hope was still held by a quiet remnant that was guarded by loyal hands, because God never gives up on his plans, even when bad things happen for a while. Even though David's throne looked broken, there was still an heir hiding in plain sight. Heaven was planning a surprise result while Athaliah ruled with an iron hand. Her story was full of deception, worshipping false gods and blood. It was about to meet the loyalty of a God who keeps his promises even when it looks like everything is lost. It looked like Athaliah's coup was final. David's royal lineage being destroyed not only protected her rule, but also threatened to break a promise made 1,000 years ago. In 2 Samuel 7:16, God told David that the throne would always be held by his heirs. When her own grandkids were killed on her orders, this holy promise seemed to be directly called into question. Athaliah was more than just an overlord. She was also working against God's plan. Her rise to power, which was based on violence and trickery, wasn't just about controlling politics. Athaliah knew that she had to weaken the spiritual roots that held the people together in order to fully control Judah. So, she didn't think twice about changing the way the country worshipped. Instead of focusing on the God of Israel, she made it a habit to serve Baal. Together with the priests of this other faith, she turned the palace and other buildings in the country into places where people could worship idols. Pagan practices were supported by the royal family, and altars to Baal were built. The people stopped following Moses' lessons, which used to lead them to do the right thing. Things that encouraged sin, faith, and spiritual dominance grew stronger in their place. This group was not only insulting from a religious point of view, but it also ruined society's morals. Baal wanted people to show their love in a crazy way, which could include cutting, sexual rituals, and even human sacrifice. The Torah and God's rules used to guide the people of Judah, but now they were led by a queen who saw paganism not just as a faith, but also as a way to control people. The story of Elijah's fight with the priests of Baal on Mount Carmel, 1 Kings 18, shows how different the two spiritual systems are. The Lord reacts with fire, but Baal doesn't say a word, even when his people are sad. In Judah, Athaliah led a cult that was just that. Loud, showy, and empty, it was a show of trickery that hid the lack of the real God. Not only did Athaliah disrespect David's memory and the promise made with his children and grandchildren by letting this system take hold in the country, she also broke the promise. She led the people into darkness and away from Solomon's temple, which was meant to be the center of spiritual life. Worship became a tool of control because of this. Even though it was dark, God's steadfastness stayed the same. People did not forget the promise that was made to David. One boy had gotten away from Athaliah's sword even when everyone thought the family was gone. His name was Joash. The queen ruled with an iron hand because she thought she had gotten rid of all threats to her power. But Joash was safe in the temple she was trying to destroy. It was a strange irony that the woman who wanted to get rid of true faith had accidentally left living the person who would bring it back. Before, Athaliah's story was full of desire, bloodshed, and worshipping false gods. But things were about to take a sudden turn for the worse, because the God of Judah had not lost. He made a promise that was stronger than any plot, and things that seemed to be dead were just waiting for the right time to come back with even more power. When Joash was still a baby, he became the only live link in God's promise to King David. He was like a secret light in a very dark place. The castle was a field of blood because Athaliah was so mean. Not even children were safe. But God, who carefully guards every word he speaks, sent regular people to do amazing things and protect what the enemy tried to destroy. Fear did not stop Jehosheba, who was the daughter of King Jehoram and the sister of Ahaziah. When Athaliah's directions were being violently carried out, she did something about it. For fear of the Israelite God, and to be true to him, she took Joash, who was only a year old, and hid him before the killers could find him. There was a huge risk. She would get the same death sentence if she was caught, but for Jehosheba, God's word could not be taken back, so her safety was not the most important thing. Jehosheba took Joash to the house of the Lord, which Athaliah would never have thought to look. Her husband, Jehoiada, was the high priest, helped her. The boy was hidden there, among the holy items and under the watchful eyes of devoted monks. He stayed hidden in that holy place for 6 years, while his grandmother controlled the kingdom with cruelty and spread the pagan cults she had sworn to set up across the whole country. But the temple wasn't just a place to hide, it was also a sign of spiritual resistance. Even though idol worship grew in the streets and castles, there was still a small group of faithful people who kept the covenant's light alive. Not only did Jehosheba and Jehoiada look out for Joash, but they also thought about what the future held for Judah. The true king was being raised in that place, away from the noise of the throne that had been stolen. This was in line with the Lord's instructions. The time of waiting was calm and clear. As high priest, Jehoiada knew he couldn't do anything hasty. It was important to be careful, smart, and ready. There was a network of priests, Levites, and loyal workers who kept the secret with great respect during those years. Every move and every step were tracked and planned. Everything was ready for the right time. At the same time, Athalia ruled with confidence, sure that she had gotten rid of any threat to her power. She didn't know that the true heir to the throne lived in the temple, which she had tried to push to the side. Even when he was a little kid, Joash was more than just a royal family member. He was live proof that God's plans can never be stopped. The promise that was made to David in 2 Samuel 7:16 had not been forgotten. Your house and kingdom will last forever in my eyes. Your throne will stand forever. It happened slowly but surely that God's steadfastness showed itself. What the Lord had planned could not be stopped by a sword, a plot, or even a queen who was determined to erase the royal memory. Hope was hidden in the temple during this dark time. A child grew there, out of sight of the queen. This child held both the blood of David and the future of Judah. The people didn't know it yet, but the time was coming to show who the real king was. There was no more silence. The lost son, Joash, was found after being hidden in the temple for 6 years. It was one of the most amazing events in Judah's history. There was no military power or political pressure that brought back David's lineage. Instead, there was loyalty, strategy, and bravery, led by the high priest Jehoiada, whose love for God was stronger than his fear of Athaliah. They watched, prayed, and made plans for all those years. He knew that if he did something wrong, the promise would be broken. Because of this, his plan was carefully and patiently made. He did more than just watch out for Joash in the temple. He also made deals, built trust, and kept people who still believed in the God of Israel hopeful. The plot that Jehoiada was in charge of was not just a revolt against an unfair government. It was a way to join forces with the Lord. Jehoiada carefully armed the temple, turning it into a holy fortress by calling together the army leaders, the caritas, special guards, and the palace sentries. Every guard knew where to stand. Every move was planned. It was time. The people were called to the temple on the right day. People were tense and looking forward to what would happen. Athalia was safe on her chair and didn't know what was going on across the city. Then Jehoiada brought Joash into view in front of the whole crowd. The boy, who was now 7 years old, carried the promise on his back and proof that God still ruled over Judah in his hands. 2 Kings 11:12 says that the event was full of meaning. Joash was given the law and the crown by Jehoiada. Getting anointed wasn't just a ceremony, it was a serious promise that the new king would follow the Lord's rules instead of people's whims. People reacted right away when they saw what they saw: cheers, raised voices, and a unified shout of "Long live the king!" Because he was smart, Jehoiada had planned everything out. Armed guards stood around the edge, ready for any attack. She ran to the temple when she heard the screams and the sound of trumpets. When she saw Joash standing with the crown on his head, the people and army leaders all around him, she let out a sad cry. Treason, treason, but she could no longer fit in anywhere. Jehoiada told them to take her out of the temple and kill her outside the holy walls. The throne, which had been taken by force, was now returned with fairness. The queen who tried to take over was killed, and God's word stood firm. Joash's ordination was more than just a change of government. It was a sign of Judah's spiritual rebirth. When Athaliah's kingdom fell, the idols of Baal were destroyed, the heathen priests were sent away, and worship of the Lord was brought back. People came back to the temple as the heart of their lives, and the hope that had been hidden was honored by everyone. The boy who had been saved from death was used to bring about change. His being on the throne was not only proof that God is in charge, but it was also a permanent sign that God keeps his word, even when things look the worst. The child King Joash started the bond all over again, and Judah could finally breathe again. Joash's election as king was more than just a political win. It was like Judah was born again spiritually. As the horns blew and the crowd cheered, it was as if the country, which had been in darkness for a long time, took in the light of renewed hope. A cruel tyrant had threatened David's throne, but it was now back in the hands of the true line. Now that God had kept his promise, justice could take its place. Athalia had been feeling safe in her power up until that point, so she wasn't ready for what would happen that day. She was scared by the sound of celebrations coming from the temple. The queen was shocked and angry, so she ran to the scene to try to get back in charge, but what she saw made her shudder. She thought she had killed her grandson Joash, but there he was, standing next to the royal pillar with all the happy leaders, guards, singers, and people. In real life, he stood for the word she had tried to break. 2 Kings 11:14 says that Athaliah yelled, "Treason! Treason!" She was so sad that her clothes were torn. When she yelled that word, it wasn't just a charge, it was a public admission that she had lost. She could see everything she had built with lies, blood, and worship falling apart in front of her eyes. People who used to be afraid of her no longer paid attention to her. There were no cheers, there were no friends. She was by herself. The high priest who had planned the rebuilding, Jehoiada, didn't think twice. He was smart and showed respect for the temple by telling them to take Athaliah outside. In 2 Kings 11:15, it says that he told them, "Do not kill her here, lest the sanctuary be soiled." He knew that this time called for more than just justice. It called for holiness. The temple was where God lived, so it was a place of worship, not anger. The order was clear: kill with the sword anyone who tried to protect her. Because of this, Athaliah was taken out of the holy area. Between the guards, her slow, heavy walk to the palace gate by herself was lonely. With an icy hand, she had ruled and killed innocent people. Now she had to deal with the consequences of her actions. Athaliah would die outside the temple walls, away from the Lord she had turned her back on. Her death was more than just the end of a cruel rule. It was also a sign. The altar was set apart for the living God, so her blood did not fall there. Her death outside the temple was a sign of how Judah was being made clean and how the holy and the vulgar were being separated. It was a clear break between Jezebel's legacy and the future that God was making possible through Joash. The people of Judah knew that this change was spiritually important because they saw it happen. It wasn't strong forces that brought back the throne. It was faithfulness, courage, and listening to God's words. The promise made to David had been kept. The worship of idols that Athaliah pushed was turned down. The temple was once again the place where people went to pray. Judah got more than just a king that day. It got back to being itself. At first, Athaliah was a threat to the royal line. But by the end, she was a constant warning that people's power can never take away the Most High's vows. The Lord is still in charge. And even when it looks like everything is gone, he always keeps a little something, ready to fix what looked like it was broken. Athaliah's fall was more than just the end of an oppressive rule. It was also the win of Israel's God over the idolatry that was threatening to corrupt Judah totally. In her time as queen, she spread horrible customs throughout the country and made worship of Baal a tool for controlling religion and government. When she died, the shrines that were built in honor of false gods were burned. Also, anything that stood for revolt against the Lord was finally taken out of the center of people's lives. Getting rid of the system of idols that Athaliah supported was more than just a gesture. It was a spiritual statement. Judea did not follow Baal or his priests. What it belonged to was the same God who had saved Israel from Egypt and made a promise to David. He now showed once more that he can't be broken. The death of Athaliah ended a time of sadness and started a new path of healing. She had taken the throne by force and stained it with the blood of innocent people. It was then given back to the line of David. God had promised that your house and your kingdom will be made sure forever before you, your throne will be established forever. Athaliah's rule was not only bad for politics, but it was also a direct threat to God's promise. Lord showed his dedication to this word by making Joash king again. This shows that even when people turn away from him, his plan stays strong. Not long after Athaliah was killed, Jehoiada became both the high priest and the spiritual leader of the people and the new king. He knew that getting rid of the intruder wasn't enough. The bond had to be rebuilt too. So according to 2 Kings 11:17, Jehoiada made a serious promise that the people would once again be God's people to the Lord, King Joash, and the people. This moment of promise was a turning point. It wasn't just a political or religious deal. It was a public confession of sin and a fresh dedication to following the Lord's ways. Once spread out and corrupted by worship, the people came together as one voice around the temple, the throne, and God's rule. The fact that Joash, who was still young, was there made the event even more symbolic. It was Judah's return. After that, there was a time of spiritual renewal, which was led by Jehoiada. He was in charge of taking down the altars to Baal, getting rid of their leaders, and setting up the temple's service again. It felt like new water was being added to the roots that David had sown and Solomon had strengthened. When Joash took over as king, he had a clear goal: to bring the people back to being loyal. For a long time, when he was still a boy, Jehoiada taught him how to tell the difference between real worship and old lies. The story wasn't just about how a cruel queen fell. It was also about how God responded to the cries of people who were tired of being ruled over. The fact that Athaliah's rule ended is a strong proof of God's fairness. In his kindness, God let the sin be found, judged, and taken away. He gave hope to a country that seemed to have lost it. Athaliah's path should serve as a warning. Power without fear of the Lord will destroy you. But it also serves as a reminder that God keeps his word and brings it back at the right time, even when things look the darkest. The Bible doesn't just tell the story of Athaliah. In the Bible, leaders who put their own will above God's will always end up in disaster. Her road of disobeying God and worshipping false gods is similar to this pattern. Her name, along with many others, rings out as a warning about what happens when power is used to go against God. Pharaoh of Egypt is one of the most famous people who fought against this spirit. Even though Moses told him what God wanted, he refused to follow it. He wouldn't free the Israelites because he believed in the power of his kingdom, the gods of Egypt, and his own power as the only master. People were punished for his pride. Plagues destroyed the land, and his refusal to give up led to the death of his army in the Red Sea, Exodus 14:28. He tried to fight against God's plan, just like Athaliah did, but it crushed him. Saul, the first king of Israel, is another name that stands out in the Bible that has a similar story. He started out humble, but his rule quickly turned into a search for power, favor, and deeds that were not in line with God's will. One clear example is when he makes an offering without waiting for Samuel, which is directly against what the Lord told him to do, 1 Samuel 13:8-14. At this point, he was already being turned down. Like Athaliah, Saul tried to keep his power by looking after things that were strong and useful, forgetting that real power comes from following the Lord and being afraid of him. But maybe the story of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, is the most obvious match. He ruled over many countries, and the things he did made him famous. But because he was so proud, he said that his successes were all his own fault. God then made him humble by making him live like an animal, without his mind or glory, until he realized that the Most High rules over all human states. Daniel 4:28-37. It's easy to see how this person is like Athaliah. They both ignored the fact that their power came from God and ended up in shame. All of these stories lead to the same lesson. No throne can stand against God's will, no matter how strong it seems. Idolatry can come in many forms, such as images, being self-sufficient, having too much desire, or not respecting the laws. All of them, though, end in disaster when put in the place that only the Lord has. But God had already kept his word. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. 2 Samuel 7:16. Athalia tried to wipe out David's family tree. Being faithful doesn't depend on people being loyal. Even when leaders fail and people go astray, the Lord brings back those who can fix things. This is what happened with Jehosheba when she put her life in danger to save Joash. This was the case with Jehoiada, who quietly got ready for the bond to be restored. The Bible often talks about the difference between how people rebel and how God is true. God always keeps a minority no matter how bad countries get. He steps in, tells them what to do, keeps them safe, and brings them back to the road. This story is very old, but it leads to something much bigger. Not only Joash, but also Jesus, the promised son, would come from David. His throne will never be taken away, and his rule will never end. God's story goes on with redemption, but Athaliah's story finishes with justice. Also, leaders can be proud all they want, but the Lord's power will never waver from one age to the next. The end of Athaliah's rule looked like it was now. The killings, taking the throne, and the rise of worship of Baal were all things that went against the promise God made with David. But even though all signs pointed to the end of the royal line, the Lord kept his word in his quiet power. God's loyalty is shown throughout history, and even when things look like they've lost, there is a plan to make things right. The best proof of this would come many years later, when Jesus, the son of David, was born. He would be the real king. What does the angel say in Luke 1:32-33? He will be great, and people will call him the Son of the Most High. The throne of his father David will be given to him by the Lord God. He will rule over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will never end. This announcement is the end of a line that started with the promise made to David, stood strong against Athaliah's plans to destroy, and finally reached its peak in the person of the Messiah. God saw what was coming, even as Athaliah tried to erase the royal lineage. Many good people, like Jehosheba, who risked everything to save Joash, and Jehoiada, who planned with faith and wisdom for the throne to be restored, fought back against her every move. This bad witch, Athaliah, had power for years, but God's care went on for generations. His plan was never in danger when pride and worship of false gods take the place of respect and obedience. The story of Athaliah shows what happens. She was shaped by Jezebel and Ahab as a child, taking on their need to be in charge, their disregard for spiritual truths, and their lack of compassion for people. But her downfall was certain as soon as she chose to directly question the Most High's will. For all time, her story is a warning to lead without fear of God, whether over a people, a house, a business, or a life, is to set the stage for judgment. Athalia wanted to be in charge of everything, but she forgot that the throne belongs to the Lord, not to people. The sad end of her life marked the end of a dark time and the start of a new day for Judah. But the fact that God saved Joash and put him on the throne shows that he works through humble people. David's family tree was kept alive not by strong warriors or partnerships with other countries, but by the bravery of a faithful woman, the wisdom of a priest who fears God, and the silence of a child hidden in a temple. God doesn't need the power of the great to keep his word. He only needs hearts that are ready to follow him. Even though Jehoram and Athaliah's union seemed smart, it turned out to be a disaster. When God's people give up their morals for personal or political reasons, things always get worse and cause more misunderstanding. When the idols of the northern kingdom were joined with the throne of Judah, it caused spiritual chaos, social breakdown, and God's justice. But God stays true even when people's disloyalty threatens everything. Every line of this story shows how choices have an effect on other people. Jehoram gave in to his wife's pressure and stopped following the Lord's ways. Because she was ambitious, Athaliah killed her own children. It was Jehoiada and Jehosheba, on the other hand, who decided to follow, even though it put them in danger. History tells us that people who choose to fear God can change the course of a nation's history. People who choose not to fear God can also change its history. But this story isn't about religion or politics. It still speaks to us. At this point in time, principles are often questioned, people want power without boundaries, and a lot of people turn away from what lasts. We should remember Athaliah's story to show how dangerous it is to not fear God, but the story of Joash, who was saved as a baby, hidden and then brought back to life, shows that God can bring healing, renewal, and meaning at any time. The Lord still rules, even when it looks like everything is lost and darkness takes over. He always has something planned. He always looks out for his people. He always does what he says he will do. David's family tree went back further than Athaliah. It kept going. It lasted through imprisonment, the silence of prophets, and many years, until the heir who would rule forever was born in Bethlehem. Not only was human blood used to set up David's throne, but God's will has always been the same. His plans can't be stopped by anyone. The end of Athaliah's life is very different from the beauty of God's plan. But the story of Joash, and most especially the story of Jesus, shows us that hope is found where God makes a promise, all the time. If this story touched you, please say Amen and tell us what it was that affected you the most. Taking part in this helps get this word to more people. Please like the movie and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Stay with us, because there is a lot more to come. Thank you for following us to the end of this incredible story. See you in the next video. May God be with you always. Amen.